The last minute. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to give it a few minutes here and let folks hop on and get themselves situated before we hop right in. But welcome. This is the Disaster Hazard Recovery Coalition's national webinar for November 29th. Let everybody hop on and such, and then we'll get going. So just give it like a minute and 30. All right, and we're just letting folks hop on and get themselves situated. Once I see the number start to slow down, we can get on going. Cool. Well, I think we're good to get going. My name is Noah Patton, Housing Policy Analyst for Disaster Recovery at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And welcome to this Disaster Recovery National Webinar. As per usual, just a few housekeeping things. Number one, we encourage folks to throw questions in the Q&A chat function. I'll ask our panelists to keep an eye on those and maybe stick around a little bit after they are done talking to knock off any questions that are still in that Q&A box. So please feel free to throw them in there. We have an excellent webinar planned out for you. We'll be hearing some updates on recent research. Then we'll be hearing from Kentucky, Florida, and Puerto Rico, talking about ongoing disaster recovery efforts in those areas. And then we'll end with a brief rundown of the policy situation at year's end from yours truly. So just wanted to, welcome everybody and, wish everybody a happy end of the Atlantic hurricane season's eve. The Atlantic hurricane season ends tomorrow. And just to let you all know that this will be the last national disaster webinar. However, we'll have plenty of opportunities for you to hear my voice and the voice of my colleagues at NLIHC talking about disaster recovery as we keep going through our regularly scheduled working groups and so on and so forth. So for everybody that's been here for the long haul, thank you so much. I think we laughed, we learned, we experienced the impact of increasing climate change on our built environment, and hopefully we can keep all that going. So I think we'll go straight into our first speaker here. So I'm going to introduce Sarah Molinari to you all. She's over at the Extreme Events Institute, Florida International University. So I'll just let you take it away from there, Sarah.
Great, thanks, Noah. And thank you to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for the invitation. I'm actually speaking from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and my internet connection has been a little spotty, so hopefully I'll be able to keep the camera on. So I'm here to share some findings from a recent article published that I published in the Centro Journal, the Journal of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, specifically in their special issue from summer 2022 on corruption. And the article title is Disaster Fraud Prevention by Exclusion, Property, Homeownership, and Individual Housing Repair Aid in Puerto Rico. And so this work and this article is based on 18 months of ethnographic field work on the politics of debt and disaster recovery in Puerto Rico that I was conducting for my doctoral dissertation. And this work comes out of over a decade of involvement in Puerto Rican studies and kind of at the intersections of Puerto Rican studies and anthropology specifically, and political activist involvement in the diaspora in New York, where I grew up. And in this article, I look at the relation between anti-corruption narratives or federal disaster fraud prevention work, disaster governance in Puerto Rico, and housing recovery in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And a central question that was animating this article was, how are people exposed to systemic housing repair aid denials in the wake of disaster, navigating these processes, and what does it mean that the US federal government oriented access to aid around a specific burden of ownership proof through official property titles? And I think that this says a lot about what scholars call the coloniality of disaster, and specifically how it played out in Puerto Rico. And so the article examines disaster governance and what I call the bureaucratic encounters and anti-corruption narratives that federal agents mobilized during home repair aid evaluations after Hurricane Maria. And I was interested in how these anti-corruption narratives play out in these mundane, seemingly neutral evaluative practices that are scrutinizing applicants' homeownership status. And again, as an anthropologist, I was interested in how people are navigating these bureaucratic encounters themselves in cases where they might be off the bat assumed as suspect or fraudulent due to their specific property arrangements and their claims to ownership, making them, according to FEMA, in some cases, ineligible for disaster aid. And I have a slide that I think will be up in a minute, but it's just highlighting this very important statistic. And I really wanted to hone in on this point. Despite Puerto Rico's legal framework, where official titles do not determine ownership, and FEMA's own guidelines, what is called unverified ownership was actually the most common reason that FEMA denied housing recovery aid to survivors after Hurricane Maria. And it's estimated that this totals about 77,000 denied households due to this reason. So it's very significant when we're talking about housing recovery. And I argue that property and homeownership is thus really a central sphere through which to examine how disaster governance is mobilized and also contested by people themselves in Puerto Rico. And the concern around how homeownership is verified, I think, plays out on two scales. So first, in this realm of individual home repair, these supposedly neutral categories to determine ownership that FEMA used to assess eligibility. And secondly, within the larger national recovery and resilience building agenda, where we're seeing millions of federal dollars allocated to recovery in Puerto Rico and certain amounts specifically to title clearance programs. And there's a debate about what title clearance does and does not do, but it's certainly, this approach has been critiqued by some as a housing patchwork solution that can potentially make properties more legible for the housing market and bring on further displacement, rather than addressing issues of housing insecurity or why people are made vulnerable to climate disasters in the first place. And just to draw a larger context, this is part of a concern of the federal government that's been long held. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, we saw the Department of Justice, for example, create a task force to investigate fraudulent claims around properties. And I do, in this article, put New Orleans in conversation with Puerto Rico, specifically for this reason, because I'm sure, as many of you know, we saw very similar patterns with denials to housing recovery access, especially around issues of quote unquote unverified homeownership that of course affects the most marginalized people. And I think these are broader patterns to think about. This very racialized and classed homeownership scrutiny is part of what anthropologist Yarimar Bonilla calls the US archipelago of racialized neglect, right? So we're seeing similar parallel processes in these two contexts. And just coming back to the article, I look at how this plays out broadly, but also I draw and I hone in on one family's experience with disaster aid applications in Caguas, a municipality in Puerto Rico. And I show how this family over time was contesting FEMA's arbitrary designation of the home as ineligible for housing repair aid because this family was assumed to live in what's called a zona invadida, or an invaded zone. And this connotates perhaps a squatter or an area with self-built homes without proper permissions or clear title. And I think it's important to relate this kind of scrutiny to racialized notions of Puerto Ricans as inherently fraudulent, right, which we've seen across its colonial history, and the connection to informal housing conditions or property arrangements that do not fit a kind of US-centric idea of private property and home ownership. The idea being that informality is inherently fraudulent or corrupt and thus ineligible for aid. And I show that this family's particular case reveals the tensions between state colonial valuations and lived experience, right? They come up against each other in this post-disaster context. And this family's ultimately successful challenge to FEMA's original designation was a way of defending their ownership claim in a landscape of exclusionary disaster fraud scrutiny. And one participant, one of these family members, very interestingly explained their struggle to assert their homeownership claim in terms of racial violence, and drew specifically on a history of land struggle and racial violence in Puerto Rico. And so just to wrap up, I want to conclude by saying that as you know, we know, disaster aid evaluations and these bureaucratic encounters post-disaster are never neutral. They're never neutral spaces. They're never neutral evaluations. And I think, and perhaps what anthropologists can contribute here is the importance to the attention to survivors' experiences in these bureaucratic encounters and throughout their application processes to really more fully understand the inequalities in recovery aid access. And secondly, I think that the official recovery project to clear property titles in Puerto Rico, and of course, the challenges that owners with unclear title are confronting in accessing long-term recovery, needs to be understood within a trajectory of popular struggles over housing, ownership, habitation, and life-making through diverse practices and diverse property arrangements that have historically been surveilled and racialized in Puerto Rico as suspect, destabilizing, or illegitimate. And that's the gist of my article. We'll be sharing a link to access it on the Center for Puerto Rican Studies journal page. It can also be found in university libraries if you have access to them. If not, I can facilitate sharing the article for sure. And I also wanted to just uplift the work of Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, which I know is a collaborator with this coalition, because their work was so key in advocating for the widening FEMA's adoption of alternative proofs of ownership that was able to get a lot of people who were originally denied aid access to it. So their work has been key here. thank you for your time.
Of course. Thank you. I love this article, mostly because we've been doing work with our partners around the title documentation issues in Puerto Rico for so long. I appreciate it being put into that kind of broader context, that it's not necessarily just a Hurricane Maria specific issue, but also an issue, more broadly in terms of how, capitalism impacts disaster recovery writ large. And I mean, I don't know if you have anything else to kind of say in terms of that connection between it. Because I know there's a lot of additional dimensions here, especially in the context of Puerto Rico, specifically in terms of colonialism and neocolonialism and so on and so forth. But, is this kind of like a glaring, example of disaster capitalism, or how does that kind of, or climate gentrification, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to also look to other sites. So for example, in Haiti, after the 2010 earthquake, there was a large interest on the part of private foundations to also put money into title clearance programs. So again, this question of making property more legible to commodify, to market, to the housing market, I think is central to how it can lead to forms of displacement. And I think the case of Puerto Rico and also New Orleans, right? If we think about this this context of US empire, right? Different sites of US empire and where racialized neglect can be seen. This is the coloniality of disaster. The fact that certain categories and assumptions are imposed on how aid is determined in Puerto Rico, and aid eligibility and access.
Thank you. And Eric, who I saw had his hand up in the audience, put a good point in the chat about a recent Office of OIG report regarding disaster recovery, and specifically talking about like the controls on local governments. Does this kind of relate to that? Because we hear a lot about red tape in disaster recovery, and oftentimes that's in the context of like state and local governments not being able to spend money whichever way that they would like to spend. Is that a different kind of concept than one that we see would address these issues by giving more flexibility to non-traditional American traditional ownership structures?
Sorry, the question about is
so there, here, let me rephrase. So there's a so what we're talking about here is creating a more flexible form of assistance without the amount of red tape. At the same time, there's often a push by state and local governments to also have the freedom to spend funds whichever way that they want. Is there a connection there, or are we talking about kind of separate things? Because I think at the state and local context, there's also implications of discrimination and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think there's a wide acknowledgement that making these categories more flexible to open aid up to more people is a huge step in the question of access. Not necessarily bringing recovery justice to its full extent, which would be right to address the conditions that produce vulnerability in the first place. I think that's part of it. But in terms of the freedom to spend funds on this kind of state and local level, Puerto Rico is largely confined, especially in terms of these evaluation practices by the federal government, right? So FEMA is the federal agency that is directing the evaluation and distribution of housing aid, not the local government, right? Different things and programs are administered through the local government, but it was exactly the work of these legal advocacy organizations like Ayuda Legal on the ground that were this, facilitating this conversation to make the changes at the federal level.
Cool. Well, I think we can leave it there. I have a bunch more questions, but I can annoy you via email later. And but thank you so much for your work and your ongoing work. And we'll be in touch. So
Thanks, Noah.
of course, thank you. So from there, I think it is most appropriate probably to go directly to Puerto Rico and introduce Marie-Tere Padilla Rodriguez, who's Director of Policy and Advocacy, Puerto Rico Operations at the Hispanic Federation, just to talk about kind of any recent updates on the impact hurricane or the recovery from Hurricane Fiona in Puerto Rico. Marie-Tere?
Yeah, thank you, Noah, and to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for the space. This is an important conversation for us and everybody in Puerto Rico. I want to thank Sarah for her work and her findings. And I do want to add that even though FEMA, with the work of local advocates like Ayuda Legal, they changed the ownership requirements policy in the individual assistance guidelines. Now, after Hurricane Fiona, still they were not advising the survivors when they did the press releases on how to prove ownership and occupancy. At the beginning, they were not mentioning the declarative statement that was the alternative document. If you don't have a property title, one of the options was to present a declarative statement. That was the main change in the policy. And after Fiona, they didn't, they were not advising the survivors about that. It was not until November, after this same Ayuda Legal and other advocacy groups of Hispanic Federation and even the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we were asking FEMA to advise people and to do capacity building to the FEMA employees to let people know that they have the declarative statement option, that they release a press, they did made a press release informing about that option, but they haven't done like an truly effective educational campaign around the media in Puerto Rico to let know survivors about that option. And that's one of our main asks, because even though we have the policy change, if you don't implement it, then there's no win. Saying that, another thing I want to mention from like a follow-up from our previous discussions in this space is that the disaster declaration that was pronounced by the president on September 21st, the deadline to apply for individual assistance was November 21st, 2022. And we have been saying that in September 21st, around 23 municipalities from the 78 municipalities in Puerto Rico were not part of that major disaster declaration. So they didn't have the whole 60 days to apply for individual assistance. The individual assistance guidelines requires the governor of Puerto Rico to request an extension to the deadline. The governor of Puerto Rico did request an extension of 30 days to the November 21st deadline, but FEMA denied that extensions, even though the individual assistance guidelines expressly states that FEMA may extend the registration period when it is necessary to establish the same registration deadline for subsequently designated contiguous areas, such as the 23 municipalities that were added afterwards. Also, when there is a continued high volume of registration, on November 21st, I went to the Caguas DRC Disaster Recovery Center, and other partners went to the Ponce, Salinas, and Santa Isabel municipalities, DRC, and they were pretty active. People were going there because it was the last day for registration. So the high volume was still there at that moment. And another element that the individual guidelines provide is that if there are significant barriers to registration, such as the extended loss of electricity. As we all know, after Fiona, in Puerto Rico, a lot of people lost electricity for almost a month or even more than a month. So I think that the three criteria from the individual assistance guideline prove that FEMA should have approved that extension. Still they didn't, and they didn't explain why. So this is something we are going to raise and keep pushing or asking for to FEMA. We think this violates the due process of those municipalities that were integrated afterwards, the first declaration. Another main concerns that we have right now is that from the 43 DRC, the centers that were open after Fiona, we only have 15 centers open, even though we have 78 municipalities. And the centers is not, the centers are needed not only for registration or to apply, but you need those centers for assistance through the whole process of the individual assistance program. If you need to appeal, if you need to address some issues with the damage assessment, all those phases of the process, the DRCs should be open to help people. So we are asking FEMA to reopen the closed centers. We only have 15, and they already announced that other 7 are going to close on November 30th. The other main issue that we have been facing, and I talked about this before, was the language access, right? The issue that we had that in the call centers in the DRC, they didn't have Spanish-speaking employees or staff to help people and provide the services. And this is important in all the phases of the assistance. Survivors as a civil rights, they have the right to understand what is happening in all the stages of the process. For example, in the damage assessment, the guidelines requires that the inspectors need to confirm with the applicant that all damage has been viewed. The inspector needs to describe the next steps in the FEMA process to the survivor when they do the damage inspection. They need to advise the applicant to contact FEMA helpline and how to get status on their cases and appeal and the required documentation. So if you have an inspector that doesn't speak Spanish and the survivor only understands Spanish, there's a huge violations of due process and civil rights. So as of November 19, from 1,200,000 applications, only, if I'm correct, 104,000 cases had been has been inspected. On-site inspections have been done. So at this moment, we can still ensure, FEMA should ensure that the inspectors are able to communicate with the survivors. I see a comment that FEMA is not sending non-speaking personnel to Puerto Rico. For example, just to say, when I went to the CAWA Center on November 21st, this woman, I was asking her about how was the process, if she had a Spanish-speaking employee helping her, and she said that a month ago, in October, just after the hurricane, when she came to the center, there were no Spanish-speaking personnel. That only one person understood Spanish, and that it was not effective, and she couldn't complete the process. But that day, the day of the deadline, that day only 4 persons were speaking Spanish and helping people in Spanish. And I think that's also an outcome of the advocacy efforts of local stakeholders saying, hey, you don't have enough Spanish-speaking people in the centers. In the same way, when you still call to the helpline, and I called today, they still say we are having trouble getting Spanish translators. So if you have somebody that speaks English, still you can have a better service if you are an English speaking person than in Spanish speaking here in Puerto Rico. Another, I'll try to be quick now. Yes, still also, we don't have, from the information that we have available, there's still no designated on-site or remote sign language translator for the deaf population. And this is important. The guidelines, the FEMA guidelines requires the deaf people population to require the sign language service. And that shouldn't be, that they should have that available permanently in the centers. The other important thing I do want to mention is that at least from the municipality of Loíza, we have a nonprofit organization that works there, Taller Salud, and they have the issue that a whole community, some of the communities have the same address. So a lot of the denials that they are receiving is because of the address issue in Puerto Rico. And the point that we're trying to make is that in Puerto Rico, the survivors do not have control of their address, of the address system, right, in our jurisdiction. So FEMA should not deny the aid because they don't understand or they cannot deal with the address system in Puerto Rico. And what we are requesting to FEMA is to do some capacity building or somehow to get case managers and inspectors to understand that even though two homes have the same address, they still need their different households and need the aid, right? So that's something that needs to be addressed after Fiona and for future disasters. I think those are the most important elements I wanted to bring up today, in addition to all of the others that we have been mentioning in the previous webinars.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I'd just say just very, very quickly, because there was a good question in the chat here. Is FEMA's inability to have Spanish-speaking employees, is that part of, just generally there aren't enough Spanish-speaking folks around that FEMA could hire, or is this just more of a capacity issue at the broader level where, FEMA just hadn't thought about it since Hurricane Maria?
I can understand that maybe at this time they're having challenges finding translators or interpreters, right? But the point that we're trying to make is that Puerto Rico is truly vulnerable to disasters every year, to hurricanes, earthquake. Today we had an earthquake in Guayanilla of 4.2 in the south. FEMA cannot wait when the disaster is already here to think about how they're going to provide the effective communication services to the people in Puerto Rico. They already know our community is a Spanish-speaking people. This is our first language. If you are going to be effective in Puerto Rico, you need to have Spanish-speaking people ready before the disaster. How we create that safety net in terms of having those Spanish speaking available, that should be a plan ahead of time. The same way with the ownership issue. You already know that more than 50% in Puerto Rico of the household don't have property titles, right? We have different forms of ownership, so FEMA should do capacity building so when the next disaster comes, FEMA knows how to deal with it. The same thing with the addresses system. That's what we're trying to achieve, that for the next disaster, we don't get people waiting 350 minutes online in a blackout after a hurricane with no home or roof, trying to get somebody that speaks Spanish online to get the aid. That shouldn't happen anymore.
Well said, well said. And we'll keep at it and working together on it and go from there. So thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on. And I'll talk to you soon, I'm sure, probably later today. From there, I was going to make a whole bunch of jokes, but we'll just go right in. Adrian Bush, Executive Director, Homelessness and Housing Coalition of Kentucky.
Hi there, it's good to be with you all. I did put together a few slides because we do have a little bit happening here in Kentucky. And this is me, so next slide. All right, so in 2021, just to refresh folks, we had two significant disasters, one in the front end of the year and one on the back end. The first was pretty widespread flooding. It ended up impacting about 50 counties, according to the state. And then in December of last year, we're almost coming up on the anniversary of it, we had some straight line storms and tornadoes that affected Western Kentucky pretty drastically. So now that we are about 10 to 18 or 11 to 18 months out from those disasters, we were fortunate to receive a community development block grant disaster relief plan or funding through Congress. And so that plan was issued by the State Department for Local Government in October. So they held two hearings, one in Western Kentucky, one in Eastern Kentucky, the week of Halloween. Initially, the allocation was about 74 million. And then an additional 49 million has recently been added to that, according to media reports. HUD designated 4 counties as most impacted and distressed, and then the state designated an additional 32 impacted counties. So we spent the last month with our partners in Eastern and Western Kentucky, looking at, and here in Frankfort and Central Kentucky, looking at what's in the state's plan. And the state has determined that after FEMA and insurance and all of that has been exhausted, there is a remaining unmet housing need of 110 million for both of the 2021 disasters. They are proposing with that 74 million to allocate 40 million of that to housing. And that leaves a gap of at least $70 million to address outstanding housing needs. Next slide. Okay, so the public comment period is over. It shut last week. And so some of the things that we noticed in the plan were that the total damaged owner-occupied units, that was about nearly 5,000 in the mid areas, and then over 5,500 rental units were damaged, also in the mid areas. But the Department of Local Government proposed 30% of the total program allocation to support single-family construction and repair, and 24% for rental construction and repair. And we didn't think that exactly matched the housing damage assessments. So the other interesting piece of it was that the proposed single family program allocation is pretty heavily weighted toward home repair, as opposed to 5% for new home construction. And our issue with that was that repairs made to homes that are now experiencing recurring flooding damage, that may not be the most effective use of CDBG-DR funds. Also repairing rental units that are mobile homes, because Kentucky has a significant amount of mobile homes as part of our housing stock. That also may not be the most effective use of CDBG-DR funds. So, and I think our main point was, with CDBG-DR funding, we have learned a lot about this process. We've had to get up to speed pretty quickly. And what we have learned from NLHC and others is that, plans should be balanced in their allocations between people with mortgages, people who rent, and people experiencing homelessness. And we just didn't see a lot of that in the state plan. Next slide. One of the things we did like was that the Department for Local Government was going to allow housing providers or developers to directly apply for housing funding. Typically they cannot do that with CDBG funding. And so, unlike some other states, our cities and counties don't have a lot of in-house expertise in housing development. But we do, particularly in the eastern part of the state, have a pretty strong network of providers, of nonprofit single-family developers. And so we do think it's a good thing that they are being allowed to apply directly. But again, on the home repair side, for some reason, the Department for Local Government really just wanted to keep things the way they typically run it with CDBG and just allow the counties. And it wasn't really clear from the plan. They also had a hard time obtaining HUD-assisted property data, and they disclosed that in the plan. But that makes it really hard to respond to the needs of people in public housing. And we did have people, we had Kentuckians in Western Kentucky definitely affected in their public housing situation. So we were just kind of frustrated with the lack of persistence in getting good data from our public housing authorities or our Louisville field office. And then lastly, the current plan just really doesn't incorporate any of the strategies promoted by HUD to address homelessness in their white paper. And that would include tenant-based rental assistance or rapid rehousing, emergency shelter infrastructure, because all of this happened in very rural communities, or for the most part, rural communities. So there just wasn't a lot of shelter infrastructure to begin with. And then another thing that we felt like they could have done was implement some sort of permanent supportive housing development set aside within their multifamily plan. Next slide. Okay, so couple of months ago, we had, of course, another disaster. Many of the same areas like Breathitt County, Kentucky, that were hit in the 2021 floods were hit again with just wild flash flooding over, a significant portion of eastern Kentucky. So we've been trying to track what's going on with FEMA. And what does assistance look like? And Eric Dixon with the Ohio River Valley Institute has done a good job trying to translate open FEMA data for those of us lay people. Okay, so one of the big complaints that we have heard and witnessed is that, the amounts of aid that people are getting are ridiculously low, which we understand, and this is not just a Kentucky problem, clearly, but just for comparison's sake, our median awards for housing assistance were about $4,500, other needs assistance $500, and then individuals and households program, the median was $4,679. Average, of course, is a different calculation. It's still only $10,000. Next slide. Okay, the property damage and needs reported by FEMA applicants, one thing that may be helpful for folks to know is that there were 13 FEMA designated counties, but then there were 4 counties that were just really, really slammed by this flooding. And so this table kind of breaks down the overall designated counties, and you can see, home damage, 13,802. But in those hardest hit counties, about 8,600 of those applicants reported home damage, and that was the share of the total applicants for those regions. That was 85%. That's a lot of home damage. Next slide. Okay, so in order to respond to this newfound reality of disasters and climate change and all of that, we have been working with partners and coalition members to determine how the state can better respond, because we know that while it was flooding in eastern Kentucky and tornadoes in December in western Kentucky, that like the next disaster is just kind of waiting in the wings. And while we're not trying to speak it into existence, we are trying to get our state better prepared and also use this to just improve our housing overall for Kentuckians, because we were already, as everyone else in this nation is, in a housing crisis. So we have been working to develop a framework that kind of builds off of our existing state affordable housing trust fund, builds on the flexibilities and the things that people like about it, and kind of makes it a permanent infrastructure for disaster housing response to really deal with both the unmet needs, the time between when a disaster happens and when CDBG-DR actually makes it to the state and to communities, so forth. And we also, I looked to our friends in Florida Housing Coalition, because of the way their state has their housing trust funds set up, and because they have experience, obviously, with disasters and disaster housing needs. So all of that is just context. Basically, we are proposing to the state legislature that they fund what we are calling AHART, that it would include emergency home repair, new home build, multifamily capital repairs, technical assistance and housing counseling. And then lastly, we always highlight that we need our state housing finance agency to have the money to do this work. Currently, our housing trust fund generates about $4 to $6 million annually, and that's wonderful, and we're not complaining about it, but there is no admin attached to that. And so if we scale up to what is actually needed, we need people to do the work. Next slide. Okay. The next phase of this would be an additional $150 million in 2024. Kentucky does a biennial budget. And so this would allow us, 2023 is not a budget year. We're asking them to open up the budget outside of a budget year. 2024 is, and so that 150 million would be asked for during that session. Basically to finish repairs and rebuilds with long-term affordability and resiliency. Again, investing in housing counseling to mitigate predatory actors and expedite large redevelopment projects. Okay, next slide. Okay, and just want to say real quick, I really appreciate our members in Eastern Kentucky and FAHI, which is a network, a multi-state network, a group of people in the development of the AHART proposal. We also worked with the Urban League in Louisville. So it's definitely been a collaborative effort here in Kentucky. And with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker, and I'll respond to the questions in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Yeah, stoked on AHART. So if you have any info on that, please feel free to drop it in the chat. I'm sure folks would like to see it. Again, I'm going to forego the jokes and just send it right over to our next speaker, Dana Lazarus from the Florida Housing Coalition. Take it on away.
Thanks, Noah, and thanks to National Low Income Housing Coalition for having me on. It's always so wonderful to work with you guys. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dana. I'm a technical advisor with the Florida Housing Coalition. We are a statewide Florida-based nonprofit that works on affordable housing issues, and we are the state's technical advisor for the Sadowski Housing Trust Fund. So first, I just want to tell you all about our state-led disaster housing task force effort post-Hurricane Ian. So for the first time, the Florida Division of Emergency Management, or FDEM, has partnered with the Florida Housing Coalition, and we are co-chairing a coordinated state-led response to housing issues post-disaster. The state task force is made up of members that lead on housing and recovery efforts at the local, state, and national level. We have members from FEMA and HUD, USDA, all the way down to our local housing and development municipal offices. At our meetings, members can ask each other questions, share information, or request assistance. This collaborative effort for housing recovery is significant for several reasons. While FEMA has led similar task forces in the past, this is the first time it's truly a state-led initiative comprised of a broad bench of members at different levels who can communicate what is going on at their level. Also, the quickness of this task force in coming together has been remarkable. For Hurricane Michael, it took over a year for the task force to form when they did it. Similarly, housing assistance has been delivered at a bit of a slower pace in the past. Compared to the immediate response of FEMA, FDEM, and others who have been coordinating funding for the Transitional Housing Assistance Program, TSA, for example, getting geared up for direct housing assistance through both FEMA and the state. And all of that just days and weeks after Hurricane Ian made landfall. So another thing is that transparency is also really key for our disaster housing task force process. So all of the meetings that the task force have are recorded and posted on our Florida Housing Coalition website. It's flhousing.org, and it's on our disaster resilience and disaster recovery page. So some key updates, what's going on in Florida with Hurricane Ian. The FEMA deadline for applying for assistance has been extended to January 12th, 2023. So that's fantastic news. We are still waiting to hear about if the public assistance application deadline has also been extended, which could be used to bring assisted housing back online. So we're still waiting to hear about that PA assistance. Also big news, the state of Florida just launched the Unite Florida Recovery Portal to connect Floridians impacted by Hurricane Ian to important recovery resources, including housing support. This is huge news, and one of the first times the state-led consolidated virtual approach has been attempted in this way. It's basically a clearinghouse for unmet needs. So it's where Florida's state-led sheltering and housing programs being run through. This Florida direct housing program will be providing temporary sheltering options like travel trailers and recreational vehicles, and temporary or permanent repairs for households whose needs are not met through insurance or FEMA's individual assistance program. Residents of Florida impacted by Hurricane Ian can also apply at the Unite Florida portal to report unmet needs such as transportation, household items, and needs for social services. And I'm not looking at the chat, but hopefully these links are being posted. Yes, awesome. Thanks, Sid. I also want to mention that we're keeping an eye on the property insurance situation because insurance money flowing into disaster impacted areas has historically accounted for the majority of total funds for rehab and repairs. For example, for Hurricane Michael, it represented over 84% of the total funds for housing recovery that went into the areas impacted by Michael. So we also know there's a host of other ongoing issues with property insurance in Florida, from endless lawsuits to insurers and reinsurers pulling out of the state. There's going to be a special legislative session in December, we've heard. And so we've heard from the former Florida Deputy Insurance Commissioner, Lisa Miller, that there are several things that she will be advocating for, including eliminating assignment of benefits contracts in first-party property cases. We learned recently that one of the two biggest insurers in the disaster-impacted areas, they're called UPC Insurance. They are in peril, and insolvency most likely lies ahead. So they are in trouble. So that was, we called around and found that the two biggest insurers for property in the Hurricane Ian disaster impacted areas were UPC Insurance and Progressive being the other one. So that is troublesome. We know that everyone needs to be insured. So two positive insurance updates are that so HUD, through the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, announced that effective December 21st of this year, it will allow homeowners with FHA insured mortgage financing to obtain flood insurance policies that conform to FHA requirements from private insurance providers. So previously, only flood insurance obtained through the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, was permissible for FHA insured mortgages. So this is great that they're expanding to private flood insurance markets. Second, the My Safe Florida Home program was announced as being open yesterday. The applications are now open for the My Safe Florida Home. The program offers two benefits: a free hurricane home inspection for all Florida homeowners anywhere in the state, and grant funding, typically a 2-to-1 match for most homeowners, but no match required for low income homeowners, for strengthening improvements for homeowners in wind-borne debris areas. And when you go to the website, they have a map that shows if you're in a qualified area. So again, anyone can apply for the home inspection. When recommended by the inspector, program grant money has been made available for home strengthening improvements to roofs, walls, doors, windows, and it's pretty great. Also, they say a third benefit comes in the form of potential for reduced home insurance premiums. So that's really kind of the big goal there. If you want to learn more about the state of insurance in the state of Florida, Lisa Miller, who I mentioned earlier, and several guests, including a former state House representative, will be on our weekly hurricane webinar this Friday. The Florida Housing Coalition does one every Friday at 1:30 p.m. So that's this Friday, December 2nd. And there should be a link to register posted in the chat to learn more about insurance. So now I will report on programs and numbers that have been passed down to the Florida Housing Coalition through the Disaster Housing Task Force from FEMA. So FEMA has conducted over 234,000 home inspections. So they are over 99% finished with their home inspections. Operation Blue Roof through the Army Corps of Engineers has installed 20,119 tarps. Over 44,400 flood insurance claims have been made, with over $652 million paid out. The Small Business Administration has provided over $962 million in low interest disaster loans to homeowners, renters, and business owners. FEMA registrations. We are at 909,053 FEMA registrations for Hurricane Ian. Of those, 642,768 people are considered housed, meaning they're in a permanent housing situation. 231,961 are currently in some kind of short-term situation. This is actually up from the 226,000 that we reported when my coworker Gladys was on 2 weeks ago. So those temporary situations are people living in hotels or motels, not through transitional sheltering assistance, not through TSA, at a secondary residence with family or friends, in their own RV or camper, or a new temporary rental. Finally, the updated number of emergent survivors, which is people living in their cars, at their workplace, in a mass shelter, who are homeless, or staying in a church, or staying in a tent. So the number of emergent survivors is now 19,207, which is up from 18,419 2 weeks ago when Gladys was on. So right now, the VALs, which is stands for FEMA's Volunteer Agency Liaisons, are on site at disaster recovery centers. So we're hearing there's about 5 on average of these folks working at the DHRCs, and they're working to connect people with unmet needs to local nonprofits and assistance organizations and other resources. Right now, we are waiting on Congress to approve a disaster case management program. Once they do, the contract will go out to bid for an organization to manage the program. This DCM, or disaster case management, is very key because people need one-on-one assistance, right? So there are several different programs to pay attention to, from direct housing to IHP, transitional sheltering, One of the ones people are very interested in is the Transitional Sheltering Assistance Program, or TSA. That's the hotel program. So think TSA, think hotels, where FEMA got folks into hotels immediately following the disaster, which again was very quick for this program. Actually, I also see I'm running out of time. Will I be cut off at 3 or should I wrap up?
You're good to go for a little bit.
Okay.
No worries.
Okay, I'm almost done. So the trend is now that people are checking out of hotels. Currently, 1,827 households representing 4,453 people are still checked into hotels. So almost 1,000 households representing almost 2,000 people have checked out of hotels over the last week. 397 hotels cumulatively have been utilized, mostly in Florida, but a few in Georgia and Alabama. As of today, 3,221 households have been approved for direct housing. That's approved. That's direct housing assistance in the form of mobile homes, travel trailers, or direct lease paid for by FEMA, or there's a couple other direct housing options. That's not eligible, that's approved. 3,221. These are people who went through the background checks and their damage was FEMA verified by FEMA, and they have no other potential funding or assistance sources. FEMA is currently working to inspect, stage, and get approval to place travel trailers that are 1, 2, and 3 bedroom in direct housing approved counties. They are running into some trouble with siting. Some commercial parks don't pass inspection because they're in a floodplain. Apparently there's a lot of them in floodplains, and they might be privately owned and the owners don't want to deal with it, or there's some other roadblock. So they're still working on it. But to wrap this up on a high note, several properties have applied for and been approved for the multifamily lease and repair direct housing program. It's one of the direct housing programs through FEMA. It's available to 6 counties: Collier, Lee, Charlotte, Sarasota, DeSoto, and Hardy. And the MLR program is where FEMA will pay for some repairs and pay for the leases of Ian survivors for 18 months. So we were told this morning by the direct housing supervisor that MLR is, first of all, cheaper than a group RV site. So for example, in Vermont, the cost of rehabbing a whole building was the cost of 1 MHU. So they fixed up 5 units for 9 people for the cost of 1 MHU. And it keeps people in the community. So they're currently looking at doing a 65-unit property in Collier County, and one other property about a half mile down the road from it. So that concludes my updates. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Dana. Yeah, happy to see multifamily lease repair doing well. So I always had a soft spot for that program. It just seems hard to implement some places, but happy it's working. And with that, I'll just say that we're over time. So instead of me giving you a rundown of the legislative end of the year disaster recovery priorities right now, you'll just be forced to have to tune in tomorrow to our disaster recovery working group session, which is at 2 p.m. every Wednesday. And invite you to join us there ongoing. Again, this is the final disaster recovery national webinar until the next time we need it. So thank you so much for everybody that's been joining. Thank you so much to the NLIHC staff that's been supporting it, and have a great one. The sign up for the working group is in the chat. So thank you so much, everybody.